Okay, great moment to bring yourselves, the audience, in. So, as I said before, what I want to do is bring in yourselves in kind of rounds of questions, sort of 4 or 5 questions at a time, and then we'll get the panel to respond to whatever they feel they want to kind of, answer. And you can ask questions. I'd like you to make points. I'd like you to be critical, and encourage debate. So feel free to speak up. And of course, this is where free speech is allowed. So here we go. So Simon's going to pass the microphone around. So anyone who wants to speak, yes, can you stick your hands up so I can see who wants to speak? So lady down the front, and then keep your hands up, and I'll take them over here. So.
Thank you. I want to go back to toilets and
keep your hands up, by the way.
toilets and the internet. So it is the case that there is still in the world many people who don't have sanitation, and there's still the case that woefully in 2012 there are areas of the world with not clean water. So perhaps the analogy could be taken a bit further, that if that massively important technology that transformed parts of the world hasn't even impacted on other parts of the world, what does the panel or what does the audience think then that the internet can do that that toilet didn't do, as it were?
Okay, great question. So, Guy,
I want to start with somewhere close to toilets. I was brought up in a medical family, and one of the myths that I was given as a young child was that children were born under gooseberry bushes, and I heard my father's conversations about how masturbation was potentially then recognized as an illness. So that's something about the context from which there was a pre-existence. Another aspect of the context is that this is part of the Industrial Revolution. So I don't know why we're getting so caught up about a technology which is an extension of telephone, an extension of television. The third point is I want to agree, we've lost sight of what we are as human beings. For God's sake, let's grow up.
okay, thanks, Guy, down the front. Yeah,
Right. I want to raise as what I think the battle over the internet's about something that's only been hinted at, which is the conflict between the social and public value of the internet, which is where it started as a purely public service, if you like, and the interests of large corporations seeking their own profits, which seems to me is becoming more and more dominant element in the internet. It seems to me that even in terms of free services like Facebook, Google, etc., they are actually using that in order to be, obviously, to make their own profits. And when Norman Lewis says Facebook isn't selling you anything, no, but it's pushing a lot of advertising, and that's how it makes its money. And there's a fundamental conflict there between some of that and some of the other elements of the internet in terms of openness and so on. As one could see, for example, in terms of Google giving in to the Chinese government, for one example. Can I just make one other point in reply to Keith Teare? You said, what harm can it do you if the world knows the truth about you? Well, I think that's wrong. I mean, if you're in Iran, for example, if you're in China, it can end up with you dead. So I think privacy does have its value in lots of contexts.
Yeah, I think I'd like to just mention to Mindy that there are some of us who do have people breathing down our necks all the time. In my case, it's Maria Kutar. She's my PhD supervisor. But I'd like to take issue with the point that Keith made, that about finding out what is the real us. I think what is a particular worry is those people who were caught up in Operation Ore, whereby the UK police genuinely believed that they had hundreds and hundreds of paedophiles and people who've been downloading indecent images of children. It had come off the internet, so therefore it must have been true. And in the vast, vast majority of cases, it simply wasn't. These people have had their lives ruined by the internet and by the police. So I think it's we have to be extremely careful about what we take from the internet and what we believe to be the truth.
Okay, great. Guy down in the corner.
I'm not going to talk about toilets. I'm going to come at it from a different angle. I was at school in the noughties. I was one of those kids who proved that the internet filtering systems were a proverbial joke. So I'm going to come at it for a different angle. Surely actually what we need is deregulation and to proverbially tell governments to get out of our space. We're talking about the internet. We're talking about somewhere where there is no way that the legal systems can understand and can work with the internet. They're not built for it. The people who are justices in the courts don't understand the internet. So in fact, I had one Crown Court judge say to me, I don't understand this internet thing. I don't understand Twitter. I've never sent a text message in my life. And that was in quite a serious case. Now, if we have that level of lack of understanding and lack of ability to work with this, isn't it time that we decided that we would declare the internet as a separate state almost, and separate it from governments and from government bodies who do not understand it and do not want to work with it to develop and actually want to be very conservative with it and stifle it in many respects?
Okay, get the panel back in. So I'll just recap, I think, some of the points, if I may. So, you know, lady down the front saying, so what about, you know, it's all good in the West, but when it comes to the third world, there's hardly much change. We've lost sight of our potential as kind of human beings in terms of the way we relate to technology, the internet. I think that's the kind of point you were making. What about the value, the social public value being lost in light of what large corporations are using the internet for? And the truth is not always good. So if you live in Iraq or wherever, Iran, you can get hounded out pretty much for what you say online. And the whole point about, again, sort of Operation OR, so therefore, you know, you can be misconstrued very easily because of what you've been doing online for whatever reason. And then the point about creating the internet as its own sort of distinct space out of the sight of government regulation because they're not fit to really deal with it in terms of policy or having the right legal terms for it. Who wants to respond to one or more of these points? Keith.
So I think the first question about the third world, I mean, you know, all technologies are distributed unevenly according to the way the world is at the moment they're introduced. Interesting enough, the internet, especially the mobile internet, has first of all started in the third world. It's interesting, I met a company from Ghana called Saya Mobile recently. And it's just two guys in a private foundation, actually, in Ghana, in Accra. And these guys have got 400,000 people downloaded a texting app that they created. Those 400,000 people created 9 million invite requests, and they've now got 40 million active users. And most of their users are in Southern Europe. Turkey, in particular, is a big place for them. And they came out of Accra. Accra has massive fiber optic cable going into it from Italy, and has become, for example, if you call Marks and Spencer's, and you'll get a perfectly English-sounding voice at the end of the phone, it's almost certainly coming from Accra, where they have English education and they speak English way better than I speak English. And that fiber cable is what's made them the hub of European call centers. My wife's South African. I've been going to South Africa every year since before Mandela was released from prison. And cell phones are ubiquitous there in townships where people don't even have a roof over their heads. But they don't have landlines. They have internet and they have mobile. So I think the internet's almost the first technology where the uneven distribution worked in the favor of the third world, as we used to call it when I was at college. Now the developing world, maybe there's other phrases that I'm not even aware of. Unlike, say, toilets, when it was the imperial power Britain that got everything first and traded, blah, 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 blah. But I don't need to go into the details. So I think there's actually some hope. And if you look at the economics of Africa recently, the rate of growth in Africa generally is about 7% now. Ours is 1 or less than 1. Africa is actually changing quite a lot recently. I think the privacy one, the one I was taken up on, I owe it to the questioners to answer that one. I'll leave the rest. And about knowing the truth. You make some obvious points, and I can't disagree with them. If I can tell you, I used to write under a pseudonym. If you look up, you'll find a book called Under Siege, written by Keith Thompson. That was me. I didn't want to be Keith Teare. Why? Because the National Front in those days used to hurt people that wrote books about anti-racism, and so I hid behind a pseudonym. I totally understand that, especially in politics and governments, privacy can be really, really, really important. Really important. And nothing I said was meant to imply that you must be public. What I was trying to address really was the fear of being known. And there are some legitimate reasons to fear being known. But there's a lot of other fear about being known that is really just fear. And comes down to really, not feeling comfortable with the rest of the human race. And I was more trying to focus on that. Having said that, I think privacy itself is private. If I want to be public, sometimes, even if it's foolish, you can try to talk me out of it, but if I choose to do it, you got to let me do it. And I think we live in a time now where especially young people are much more comfortable being public, not because they're ignorant, but because of a lot of the reasons Norman talked about, to do with peer pressure and how you get in networking. I live in Silicon Valley. I can tell you, every entrepreneur worth their salt wants to network. Their Facebook page isn't for their friends. It's so you can look at how cool they are. And so it's about broadcasting yourself publicly to have a positive impact on how others see you, and it's kind of produced public.
Maria, did you want to?
Just to go back to the question of, I guess, kind of equality of access in the developing world. Like Keith, I'd like to give you an example of somewhere where I guess the ordering effect of how people can access technology is different. So in Africa, it's common for farmers to grow crops which they sell to a middleman. The introduction of the mobile phone, which using internet technology, means that a farmer can now find out what is the appropriate price for a product, which gives them incredibly increased power in terms of the relationship and the price that they can get for their product. So the internet can actually improve the standard of living, which might then allow them to go back and to then start to take up some of the other technologies that in the developing world we've had first. So the ordering effect is not necessarily the same completely around the world. And actually, I think that's a lovely example of how the internet actually, we shouldn't assume that everybody should have things in the same order that we do. We might be able to use it to actually drive forward people's improvements in living standards.
So. Yeah, okay. I'll just give Mindy.
Again, on the toilets. Well, no, I think it is a really interesting point, but coming at it from a slightly different angle. If you look at communication and the importance of technology and communication in joining up communities, I think the internet has the potential to improve things quite a bit. Take state building in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. That occurred when you had a lot of disparate villages and communities that saw the guy, 5 miles down the road as other. And then suddenly there were roads being built and canals and then train tracks, and then you had the telegraph and the postal system, and then there were newspapers that were circulating, and suddenly people had something that was similar, and they could communicate with each other, and they were reading the same things, so culture started to develop. And what we have, as you see the internet spreading into the third world, is the ability for knowledge and for shared culture, for memes. Lolcats, they may be funny, but everybody around the world enjoys them. And it's a way that people sort of start to feel a sense of community. And once you start to do that, people begin to share knowledge, they begin to share technology, business. It's not so scary to venture, your business into a third world country, because you kind of already have a bit more familiarity with the country. So I think in that sense, the internet expanding rapidly, even where there aren't toilets, possibly has the potential to bring other sorts of technology to help the development along. In terms of this social versus commercial interest, that's something which I wrestle with on a day-to-day basis, because I work, I spend a lot of my time trying to get businesses listed in Google, but I have a real conflict with the way in which Google operates. And I think it is something to be dealt with, because there are a lot of people who think that Google is the internet, that Google owns the internet and Google runs the internet, and Google is a business. And no matter how much Google says that don't be evil, they're in the business of making money. And they're in the business of gathering your data so that they can use that data to generate more advertising revenue. And at the moment, they are in the process of rolling out the Google Plus network. I don't know if anybody is familiar with Google Plus or has a Google Plus profile yet. A few. Well, Google wants everybody to move away from Facebook onto Google Plus, including businesses. And Google is doing this in the name of getting rid of spam and understanding who legitimate people are and who fake sock puppet identities are. And in order to do this, they're telling you can only have one online identity. And I think that probably plays into what that gentleman was saying. But
okay, all right. I'm just conscious of the time, so Norman, if you can maybe do one point.
Right. Well, I was going to make a response to your point, but I won't, because I think it's been very well dealt with. Apart from saying that we are seeing now things coming out of the developing world which are in advance of what's happening in the developed with regard to mobile technologies. Keith mentioned a few. I mean, what it's done for farmers, what it's doing for example, a system called Mpenza. I don't know if you know about that. It's a virtual banking system for using texting for the unbanked, which is opening up credit to smallholders, etc. Huge impact on farming and productivity in Africa. Massive. I wasn't. I'm not answering it. I want to come back on this point about commercial interests and all of that. You see, I mean, I really do sometimes think that we get a little bit silly when we start talking about this, because, what's the worst that Google are going to do with your data? They're going to try and sell you advertising. My God, I mean, that's to be feared. Thank God for Google spam filter. I mean, it's the best thing in the world, actually, in terms of a technology that works. It's absolutely unbelievable. But my point is this. The problem with all of these concerns is that you're raising something which is rather kind of peripheral to what the real problem is. The real problem is that they're not good enough yet to really understand what you want and what you need. Because all they're doing in mining all this data, and let me tell you that they don't do it very well. They don't yet have the capability and the systems to do it well. Because all they are doing is they're trying to predict your behavior and what you've done in the past. Now, as you know, you cannot drive a car by looking in the rearview mirror, okay, which is what they're doing. And I don't know. There's a great example. Is it Netflix? They had this big competition about could somebody get them an algorithm that they'd be able to predict more precisely what movies were going to be box office hits and everything. And they spent millions on this. And they eventually got an algorithm that did this. And the algorithm improved their ability to predict by 0.1%, which basically means that for 98% of the time, they don't get it right. but they spend millions of dollars going after this. And what you say is a lot of these companies are going after it's like a quest that they are never going to achieve, because this is a false nirvana. All it really indicates is there's a real poverty in thinking about new business models around what we might be able to do with this kind of data. And what we're trying to do is just simply invent systems that are trying to predict the unpredictable, which is you. Because what influenced you to see a movie last week is never going to be the same next week. You're never going to, human beings are unpredictable in that sense. And they're trying to make a science out of something which you can't make a science out of. And as a consequence, they are spending millions of your dollars, and they're creating systems that I think are raising the kinds of issues that you raise. And these corporations are now becoming so powerful, they are becoming the problem. Whereas in fact, the real problem in all of this is not them, it's the fact that the state is now saying you've got to hold on to this data, that we can mine it. And that's where the privacy discussion is really important. It's not about what we think of each other, but it's our data being used by the state. I think you must make a distinction between where the fear should be, whether it's in these corporations or whether it's the state. I think that's, another debate.
Okay, great. So, audience, who wants to speak? Okay, yep. If you keep your hands up, and then I'll go there.
Going back, I think, to what the guy down there was saying, do you think that there's an issue in terms of almost a disconnect between a lot of the people that are using and understanding the internet and the people that are legislating regarding the internet, or possibly even habitually voting for the people that are legislating about the internet?
Right, a few points actually. First of all, back to toilets, but the water in them, or ideally not the water in them, because I think that's an unfair, it's a bit of an unfair comparison between water as a crucial staple human thing and the internet, because the internet at the moment, dare I say, doesn't fit into Maslow's hierarchy. So you've got a situation where actually it's not one of the drives basic needs like sanitation, etc. So that as a comparison is probably a little bit flawed. I know we've come back to it a lot, but ideally no more. But really, one of the things I wanted to kind of concentrate on was more about a theme that's running through this. One of them is really about the human aspect to using the internet. As was mentioned, if you like, the saying, guns don't kill people, people do. They use the guns to do that. It's just a tool. Whether you use it for malicious purposes or anything else is another matter. So I think the social theme running through all of the discussions here seems to be pretty common. And also really the self-regulation aspects of it as well, because it's a bit about feedback. We've talked about friends telling you that, okay, you've done this wrong, or you dressed a bit funny. That's the kind of local feedback loop with peer pressure. And we've talked about aspects of legislation, which is another form of feedback, but obviously on a much larger scale. And indeed, how do you regulate something that's much more global, like the internet, where you've got these let's call them micro sort of legislative environments like China or the UK or North Korea, whoever. So the question is, how do we go about solving that problem without necessarily creating a state out of it? If that makes any sense. So that's my question. So.
Okay, thanks. Guy down the front, and then
which one?
There's been a lot. I mean, I think back on all these historical developments that take place: the telegraph, the telephone, the radio, television, and you'll always find that they were to blame for society's ills. I think there's much to say that the internet, it creates a rather strange thing, because it's not actually real. But if you treat it as a public space, and if we look today at, in particular, how the public space in this country especially has been encroached by local authorities and the state, the same is happening on the internet. I would argue, I think there's been that sort of thing of like, which has been mentioned, that in actual fact, like it reflects it's society that comes first. It's what society that allows in the real world to happen, that allows the authorities to go ahead with what they do on the internet. I mean, it's rather interesting. I mean, even the sort of thing, there's always this big paranoia about collecting data. The internet didn't actually start off with data. the governments have always collected data for their own reasons. I think, Keith, you might well remember an organisation, the Economic League, who used to collect all information on lefties and radicals at the time. The state has always done this. What has happened is that the internet has just made it easier. But it's not just made it easier for the state, it's made it easier for us all. It makes it easier for the state because the state's in that position. But ideally, it makes everything easy for it makes the world easy for us all. Sorry.
Hi. I know we moved on since the sort of third world discussion, or developing world, but I just want to say that it's not just about how resources and technology filters through to the developing world, but how we use the internet here, and we can use social media to sort of build a platform to make a case for progress and change and for universal development. It was notable with the Hurricane Sandy that some of the commentators were actually saying that has America brought this upon itself because of its sort of its wastefulness and its consumerist lifestyles. But I think we need to challenge arguments like that and argue that a lot of deaths were probably prevented in New York because of urban development and because it's a great, strong infrastructure. And I think we need to argue a case for universal economic development throughout the world and make a case for freedom and the freedom of speech, even if it does cause offence.
Okay, great. Guy right at the back, in the red shirt, and then the guy.
Hello. I think a first point is if you think the internet hasn't changed the way we live, then you're fooling yourself, because the fact that the modern laws can't deal with the internet and how it's changed the way we live, I think proves that. I think an important question is, what do we want the future of the internet to be? And I think the people who should be allowed to choose that are the youth, the people who are going to inherit it, and the people who are going to live with it for all their life. And if you look at the youth today, what do they want to do with it? They want to share, right? They're BitTorrenting, they're sharing music, they're sharing films, they're sharing information. This is what they want from the future of the internet. So I think that's something that's important. I think another important point is how is the internet funded? At the moment, it's pretty much through advertising. And I think if you know what advertising is, it's pretty much just brainwashing. So we need to find a way of funding the internet without having people be brainwashed. So using Facebook. I've seen people use Facebook at house parties. They're surrounded by their friends where they want to use Facebook. It's like, what's wrong with you? And a final point is, who do you ask more questions to, God or Google? And who gives you your answers 50,000 in 0.39 of a second?
Hi. Well, I was going to say something pretty similar to what he said and to the man downstairs, which was basically with the judge not understanding how Twitter works and all of that, that's just because it's kind of like looking at it in reverse. It's the right time, but the wrong people handling it. The younger generation is going to grow up and take over. They're going to become judges. They're going to become lawyers. They're going to become presidents and whatever. They're going to understand how Twitter works. They're going to understand how social media works. So basically, I just think it's a question of time. That basically by the time my generation is probably in their 60s or 70s, younger generation will be handling things a lot better because they've grown up with the internet. Kids who are 5 years old are using iPads better than people who are 28 who bought the iPad. And that's just generally how the internet's going to be in the same way. Now, the question which I was actually pretty interested in was the commercialization and socialization. Basically, water used to be free, but now we pay a lot for it. It's the same thing with the internet or whatever. Once you can make money off anything, people are going to try and make money off anything. So I just think that's just a normal, basic capitalist state of people's individualities, So going forward, I just think that's just a normal human nature, and I don't think there's anything which should change that.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Jenny. I'm a lecturer. I just want to say something. First of all, I believe internet has changed the way we live and we do business, in particular in the developing world. For instance, like in China, there are about 380 million of internet users at a growth rate about around approximately 14% each year. So it's ranked at the number 2 in terms of number of users. And compare with other countries. And the UK is about ranked number 9. Of course, America is the big user at the moment. But if you look at the deep penetration, lots of business done automatically online in America and the UK. So you're talking about 87% to 90%. The business is done online, where though in China, the deep penetration rate is really low. So which indicates that there's a huge growth and the potential in the future. Perhaps the internet could bridge the world, developing world and a developed world together and has kind of positive impact on how we do business. That's one. But my observation on, sorry, try to just quick question, okay. Has the positive impact on the consumerism and the economic and all that around the world. But I think it has negative consequences on human interaction, because I really hate the young kids all using iPad and not keen to talk to people around them, even the family members. So the social behavior has changed dramatically amongst the young people. So my question is our society and the whole world is going to be based on technology or love? Okay, that's my question. Thank you.
Right, panel. I'm not going to sum all those questions up because too many. But can you be brief in your responses? Maybe just pick up one point, and I want to get more questions in before we wrap up. Okay. So Keith.
Yeah, he knows me well. It sounds like. I'm going to pick the question about how is the internet going to be funded, and the point that it's currently funded by advertising. Google has missed its earnings 3 quarters in a row when measured by something called CPC growth, that is cost per click growth. The reason it's missed its earnings is because mobile use is growing and desktop use is declining. Think about the hours in the day you sit at a laptop or a desktop now versus the hours in the day you use a mobile device, and we all know which direction that's going in. You sit at a desktop mainly to work now, not for anything else, unless you waste your time, but mostly it's for work. And mobile device you got with you the whole time. Mobile is not monetizable via the same advertising methods that the desktop was. And we're kind of moving back to a 2 screens world. Screen 1 is your TV and screen 2 is mobile. And that third screen, the laptop, desktop, is declining. 90% of all the internet's revenue from advertising is desktop-based. The reason Facebook's stock declined by 50% since it did its IPO is because it went public right in the middle of that problem. And its mobile users are now 600 million, which sounds good, except it doesn't make any money from them, or very little. If you've been checking Facebook on your mobile device the last month, about a third of the screen real estate now is ads. And that's because they're desperate to figure out how to make money on mobile. It's very likely that Google's absolute revenues will decline soon and that Facebook's absolute revenues will decline soon. And that actually represents a crisis, a huge crisis for the internet, because if money isn't being pulled in from the big brands and the advertisers, you can't afford to pay the salaries and the engineers and everything to keep it going. So there's a huge impetus now. In Silicon Valley, it's probably the #1 focus to answer the question, how will mobile be monetized? How will mobile be monetized? And I have an answer, but he's not going to let me tell you.
Not now. Summing up, yes. Mindy, do you want to?
Right. I was going to bring up net neutrality in terms of the commercial internet and how things are going to be funded, and obviously it's going to be a pay-to-play basis, I think, unless somebody steps in with legislation. Businesses paying ISPs to drive traffic to them and forcing the smaller men out of the market. But in terms of the mobile argument, or your point about mobile, Keith, I was at Google about 2 weeks ago, and they gave a huge presentation on mobile and targeting advertising for mobile and how important it is for businesses to start building their websites for mobile and targeting their advertising for mobile users. So they're already looking into it, and they're already trying to sell it to the people that they need in order to keep the revenues up.
Okay, great. Maria.
I'll pick up on a different point, which was the question about whether the internet's having a negative impact on our social interactions. And, you know, there's been some quite good examples here of, you know, people who'd rather kind of play on their iPads or be at a party and Facebooking their friends instead of talking to the real ones. But we should also remember that actually the internet has had an enormously positive impact on our social interactions. It has closed down the distances that exist around the world. It means that you can Skype someone, you can be face-to-face with somebody from anywhere around the world at a very, very, very small cost. And for that reason, I think it's had an enormously positive impact on our social interactions.
Norman, brief.
Yeah. Funding. I'm really in favour of this crisis that Keith's talking about, because I think what it'll do is it'll force people to start doing a little bit more serious stuff with all the money that they have, instead of going after this quest, as I said, of this elusive advertising, which is just just so lazy and so short term. What I hope will happen is that Silicon Valley will wake up one morning and decide that instead of trying to get a quick return in the next month, that they're prepared to put some of the vast resources that they have, the reserves that they're sitting on. I'm talking about the Apples of this world, you know, sitting on billions, literally billions, that they'll start putting money into proper research and development and start doing some basic research and start making some breakthrough technologies that will herald the next generation of inventions that will shape the 21st century. Just remember that everything that we are basing ourselves on today, the transistor, all the computing that we're talking about, this was invented in the 50s. This was a 20th century invention, and this came out of laboratories that were based upon, that did research without any business models that said, what's the outcome going to be before we give you funding? They were prepared to indulge in research because they thought the pursuit of knowledge would lead to discovery and create an invention of new industries. And I think that's what we need now, not trying to revamp an internet around failed business models, essentially. Because I think that the technology underpinning the internet, you know, who says that that's as good as it should be? You know, what about faster networks? What about making it more ubiquitous? You know, there are so many questions that still remain unresolved. It's not as good as it could be, ladies and gentlemen. The internet has got a long way to go.
Thank you. So last kind of round of questions. So who wants to ask, make some more points? Any new questions? Got one lady who's just spoken. Any more? Must be more burning questions. Come on. Anyone disagree with what the panel has said? I mean, anyone think the internet should be more regulated? It is. When you said disagree, I yes. Is she just doing that for effect? I don't know. So let's try.
I don't necessarily want to disagree. I just want to get back to this issue of social interaction. My background is in psychology, and I've sort of read a lot of research around cultures of technology and the way that our use of technology actually changes the way we do think about ourselves, our own identity, and the way we interact with other people. And I think as well that the internet can be a brilliant tool to communicate, and like you say, to communicate face to face. And that's what I do quite a lot. But I refuse to go on Facebook because I like my friends in the real world. And I like to spend my time really connecting to the people who are important to me, rather than sort of promoting myself to loads of people I don't even really know. But I think we're sort of moving more towards that, and I think that can be really detrimental in the real world.
Okay, who else? At the back? Yeah, Simon, you have to run all the way at the back, please. Oh, sorry, no, I'll come back to you.
Thank you. I'd just like to say I'm a lecturer in film production, and this time last year I set up a Facebook group for the students, because what they do is dependent on collaboration. So our filmmaking students will work with script writers, they'll need to enlist the help of actors, and music composers and whatnot. So all elements of what would make a film come together. So we set this group up not knowing how it was going to take off. And it's actually surprised me no end to the fact that students are fully supportive of each other's ideas. They put projects out there for each other to have a look at and critique, gather feedback from each other. So peer kind of feedback that they're gaining, other than having to come to their lecturers constantly for feedback. And also the fact that they help each other out. They've been so supportive in giving technical advice. We've had students who are, you know, in the edit suite and they're stuck on a problem that they can't seem to get to grips with, some factor in the edit suite that they need to technically find out what to do or what buttons to press, in which case they can just have instant feedback from somebody who knows how to help them and assist them. So it's just so surprising. And in terms of the users, we've never had to, you know, as an administrator of the site, we've never had to step in and say anything's out of line. So it's nice to see that the collaborations can be formed, and I think you've got to have faith in the users that they will use it responsibly.
Okay, thanks. Who else? Okay, you two have spoken before, right? So guy in the white lanyard down here, then I'll take the
One of the things you hear a lot in people talking about the internet is lazy journalism, and I don't sometimes think we don't stop to ask questions there whether it's lazy journalism or whether it's very high pressure 16 articles a day journalism. And I think maybe should we be asking questions about what the internet's doing to the content that's being produced for the internet, whether it's maybe pushing a news story away from a valuable news story and more to a token which is going to be passed backwards and forwards through people's social media accounts without being looked at, and kind of the implications of that.
Thank you. And then the lady just here, and then we're going to bring the panel back in.
Hi, just going to be very quick. Let me just go back to the social impact. I totally agree with the panel that internet has many positive impact, including the social impact. My point was really trying to raise awareness about the issues, because there are hard facts about the issues risen from the technology and the internet. Lots of articles written about, for instance, like the addiction to playing game online, broken families, and, you know, children's psychological problems, all of it. So I think that our life, we need to understand what are good for us and taking a positive step forward, but actually to acknowledge that those are the issues that also existed. I don't think our life should be driven by technology, but we should fully utilize what technology do for us in a positive way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So what I'm going to do now is bring the panel back in reverse order. So, and get them to sum up in 1 minute if they can. So Keith and Norman, I'll be timing you. So Maria, your go.
Okay, so very quickly, I'd like to return to the theme of regulation. I don't think it's the internet that we need to be considering in terms of what we regulate. I think we can choose. We can either try and regulate human behaviour, but I don't think there's necessarily a great deal of evidence to suggest that the internet means that we need to regulate it in a different way to previously. Or we can choose to regulate the more powerful interests, the governments and the corporations, to ensure that where we put up our data, where we put ourselves forward on the internet, that they behave with it, if you like. Most of the issues that arise don't arise because of the technology, they arise because of the way that we behave. So things like the question about Operation Or, that's about enforcing proper evidential standards that exist regardless of the internet. So I think we should be very careful in terms of the sorts of regulations that we introduce, particularly bearing in mind the points that have been raised about the lack of understanding among people like the judiciary and politicians of the internet.
Thank you. So, Keith, 1 minute.
For the person who talked about the internet dumbing us down a little bit, Andrew Keen's written a couple of good books. One is called The Cult of the Amateur, which is all about not being able to distinguish between good content and bad content due to the overwhelming massive content, and the poverty of the filters and software that lets you get to the good stuff. It's a great book. You'd enjoy that book. And he's written a second book more recently, which is all about Facebook's impact on privacy. He's the anti-Silicon Valley guy, Andrew Keen. So I think his books are on Amazon here, and he's a good writer. I disagree with. He's a good friend of mine. He used to work for me, actually. I disagree with everything he says, but he actually says it really, really well. And in the spirit of free speech, it's worth reading his books. My point that I want to talk about is the real world, both social interaction, but also like at the back on the movie, the film production stuff. The real world and software often don't go together very well. Software is written, and then the writer expects you to fit into it. What you really need is software that helps you do what you want to do. And on that note, just go to just.me and sign up, because you'll love it, all of you. And at the back, Convo. Convo would be a great tool for what you just described, CONVO.
Thank you, Keith. So, Mindy.
Right. Right, summing up, quite a lot covered, but I think my thoughts overall on the subject is there's huge possibility for improving communication, improving understanding, and generally spreading real knowledge to people. But that there's also a danger in terms of the way people use the internet if we don't educate people about what they're doing, the impact of what they're doing, and how it can affect them in the future. And I suppose as well, what Maria said about regulation really being looking at the corporations and the governments and how stopping them from doing things they shouldn't, I suppose.
Okay, thanks. Norman.
Just want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. Very difficult to summarize the discussion because there's been a lot of good points and a lot of stuff covered. But my point, which I began with, which is about my concern about us living in a culture that is now has raised the kind of self-absorption, self-awareness, this complete introspection, individuation to the point of an institution, namely Facebook, is really focusing us on the wrong things that we should be thinking about. And one of the things that I came across when I was just thinking about this discussion this evening, and was looking at this point about predictive analytics and the stupidity of advertising. Do you know that when the Mars lander, landed on Mars, they had predicted it landed 1.5 meters away from where they had predicted it would land. It had traveled hundreds of millions of miles, and they were able to predict where that thing was going to land on Mars. Unbelievable. And here we have everybody going after predictive analytics to try and work out who's going to buy the next Mars bar. Ladies and gentlemen, I pose it to you in those terms. We've got to think more about Mars and not Mars bars. Thank you.
Very good. So, can we thank our speakers for a really entertaining debate? Thank you.